Great. Dr. Khalsa, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you to the Gaze Ahead podcast. Thank you so much for joining me this morning, this early morning.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Excellent. So I first want to know a little bit about you and your journey to get where you are today and how yoga became a part of your life. If you could tell us about that.
Sure, I was an undergraduate student at the University of Toronto, and I had a significant interest in the idea of these deeper states of consciousness. And so I had resolved that I wanted to engage in some kind of contemplative practice with that as an end goal. And so was obviously one practice that not only was contemplative, but also had a feature that it had many different components leading to that goal of contemplative states. It wasn't just meditation, it was also the breathing techniques, the postures, the diet, a whole sort of a lifestyle approach, if you will. And so I was just about to pull the trigger on trying to hunt down a yoga studio or a yoga class somewhere when I heard that there was a course at the University of Toronto on yoga. So this was like boom. Obviously, something that made a perfect fit. Not only would I be able to take the yoga, but it would be for credit. So I started practicing, and it was the style of yoga which I practice now, which is Kundalini yoga, as taught by Yogi Bhajan. And I started that practice and practiced fairly regularly for a few years, and then I moved, and then that just grew into knowing the people in the community who were teaching that yoga. They had a yoga ashram just off campus, and I got to know them and spent a lot of time with them. Ultimately, I moved into the ashram and lived the ashram lifestyle. Early morning rising, lots of yoga, teaching yoga, working in the ashram businesses, etc., and just immersed myself in that. I was at the time when I first got interested in yoga, interested in science and studying science at the University of Toronto, and then I got my bachelor's degree, but then I let that go. But then in the mid '70s, my interest in science started coming back, but it was retargeted at the idea of these contemplative states. And so I resolved in the mid '70s that I wanted to do research in this area. So what I had to do was go back and take undergraduate courses that ultimately allowed me to start a PhD program in neurophysiology at the University of Toronto. This was conventional neurophysiology. I mean, nobody was doing anything with meditation that I could work with. So I got my PhD. 1984, I figured, okay, now's the time I'm going to start doing research on yoga and meditation. Well, nobody was doing it except for maybe Herbert Benson, and I actually got to meet him at that time, and he said he was only taking on people who had MDs who could cover their salary. So I had to switch to another field that was of interest to me, and that turned out to be biological rhythms and sleep. And I studied that for 10 years at the University of Virginia, and then moved to Brigham and Women's Hospital at Harvard Medical School in 1995 and continued that work. And now at Harvard, at least I was working with humans and working with sleep and circadian biology. And then finally, the National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health started funding full grants. And so in 2001, I got a grant that was a 5-year career award that allowed me to actually start doing research on yoga practices. And that grant was for a study of yoga for chronic insomnia. So that was that. And then since 2001, I've been doing research on yoga pretty much full time.
Wow, that's amazing. What role do you think research plays in the shift that we need to see in society with respect to awareness of the self and self-control? How important is research in bringing yoga more broadly into the world?
Well, our society doesn't have any of these contemplative practices built into it. It's not part of the culture. And one of the biggest benefits of yoga, of course, is stress management, emotion regulation, and improvements in mind-body awareness, physical fitness, and then, of course, also ultimately over time, these deeper, spiritual states and experiences. And our society is just, as I say, devoid of these. And so we have an epidemic of chronic stress, which is completely unmanaged. And so there's a great need for these practices to be embedded in society. And, we have a great popularity of yoga right now on the grassroots level. Surveys in the US are showing that in 2017, 14% of US adults have practiced yoga in the past year.
Mm.
And the growth in that is almost exponential. So it's growing very dramatically. But the problem is that the demographic is pretty skewed to those who are white, to those who are middle-aged, to those who have more income, and to those who are more educated. So it's a really privileged, narrow sliver of the population, and arguably the people that need it the most are the ones that are getting it the least. So what we need is to expand that popularity across the demographic. And the way to do that is, as you've suggested, is to how do we embed it into society, into society's institutions, into the public schools, into the workplaces, and into the healthcare system. And of course, the most powerful place to put it is in yoga in schools. And my laboratory has been conducting a number of studies in yoga in schools. We've published over half a dozen trials. And the purpose of the research is that when you're talking about embedding something into mainstream society's language is modern science. And their basis for evidence is research studies. So policymakers cannot justify the implementation of yoga within societal institutions unless they have this research evidence base. So, for example, a principal can't say, I can barely get the curriculum in for what we need to teach the kids in terms of the academics. You're asking me to take something out to put yoga in. You need to justify that. And you need to show what the benefits are and that those benefits outweigh the negatives of the loss in time that the yoga practice is going to take. And again, that is the research evidence that's necessary. And what we do have in the schools right now is really a huge burden of mental health problems. It is really it's really astronomical in terms of what's happening with our kids, and most people don't recognize that, but they have a huge mental health burden in our children and adolescents.
It's so true. And with technology today and the disassociation with human connection that we're seeing in the young ones as they grow, it's only going to perpetuate itself. So they need to come back to themselves, come back to the grounding, and to have real relationships. And yoga is a tool perhaps that can help us gain those skills. Is it possible to do yoga when you're a kid? I have a 7 and a 9-year-old here. We have some yoga practice, but it's mostly play. How young were the kids in your studies, or what age group did you focus on?
So it gets more difficult the earlier the age is. So if you're looking at elementary school, it's more difficult because there's fewer outcome measures, there's fewer instruments you can use. The kids are not as good at self-reporting. Our studies have mostly been done with middle school and high school. But in terms of the applicability of yoga, it goes right down to babies. I mean, it goes down to toddlers. I mean, my wife was teaching yoga to toddlers, to preschoolers. I mean, and you're not doing what happens in a yoga class. That would, of course, never fly with this population. So it is more along the lines of games and fun, and you're pretending to be a lion and you adopt that posture and so on. But what the kids are learning at that age is basically some fundamental skills of self-regulation, how to become quiet, how to quiet the mind, how to relax, and how to be aware of what's going on mentally. And that's just a very fundamental skill. So you can take a bunch of kids that are bouncing off the walls like crazy at the beginning, and then 30 minutes later, they're all lying supine in total silence. That is that idea of self-regulation. So that's what you can teach.
That's a secret weapon for teachers, secret weapon for parents. I think you're onto something here. Speaking of self-regulation, I want to switch gears and talk about business leaders, entrepreneurs or leaders in a business setting. In my experience in the corporate world, we need more self-regulation. We need clarity in decision making. And can you talk a little bit about clarity or, the ability to control the mind and how important that is when you're making a decision?
Absolutely. And the whole idea of executive functioning in the brain is due to two things that are sort of opposing. One is interference. And if you are under chronic stress, or you're experiencing major depression, or chronic low back pain,
Mm-hmm.
or anything that is a dysfunction to some degree, that's going to obviously impair your executive function. I mean, you can't be at the top of your game executive wise if you've got chronic low back pain. It's just it's counterindicating, and stress, chronic stress takes a lot of the central nervous system resources away from your ability to engage in executive function. It's the same with the immune system. I mean, chronic stress is the major impairer of the immune system. So first of all, what we need to do is just bring things back to normal. Get rid of that unmanaged burden of chronic stress through the self-regulation of stress and emotion. So then you bring that into play. Now you're freeing up the resources for the executive regions of the brain to come into play. And the aspects of yoga that most are relevant to that are the meditative practices, the focus of attention. When you focus your attention in the act of meditation, what you're doing is you're engaging the attention networks of the brain. Mm. This is in the prefrontal cortex, where the attention networks are, in the frontal lobes. This is the executive region of the brain. Mm. And that is as you practice meditation over time, engaging the attention networks consistently, regularly with practice, you improve your ability to attend to your own thoughts, to attend to your sensations, to attend to your environment. The more sensitive and attentive you are to your internal and external environment, the more information you have to make better decisions. Mm. So you're improving that core attention network that really is important for executive function. And then the final thing I would add, which is something that is going to come into play over a longer period of time, and that is this sort of deeper experience, this deeper contemplative state, which brings people to this sort of really intuitive relationship to themselves and to the world. It comes from this unitive state that occurs during meditation practice over time. People feel at one with everything. There's a sense of flow. And that flow state's also associated with a substantial amount of improved creativity and improved intuition. And so that's where an executive, for example, in a corporation could then have the resources and the capability to start thinking outside of the box. And of course, that whole phrase outside of the box is gold to any corporate, because that's where you end up with these insights and these decisions that are revolutionary for any business or any business direction.
It's so true. It's so true. I love that, in your flow, or unlocking the executive function of your brain through the relief of stress and self-regulation of your stress and your emotions in the workplace. It's all very relevant. It's all very relevant. What about the duality of the ego and ambition as it relates to business performance? Is there a way that we can decouple that with yoga and still be ambitious, but maybe perhaps the yoga brings us back to the why are we here, what are we doing, and the human connection in business? Because really, at the end of the day, it's about human beings, and it's about who you work with and who you influence with your energy to get
right.
something done.
And I think a key here is the word duality. And it's the opposite of the word unitive, if you will. So you're either unifying or you're becoming more dualistic. And dualistic is me versus you, us versus them. I'm climbing the ladder. I'm trying to beat the other executive to that vice president position. I want to make more money. I want to make more money than everybody else. It's me versus everybody else. So that's that duality state. And a lot of us are really, and the majority of society is really trapped in that duality. Materialistic goals are really dominant in modern society. People want to become rich, they want to become famous, they want to become powerful. Those are the sort of major goals in life, and those are very materialistic. And we know from a lot of psychological research that those kinds of materialistic goals never lead to happiness or
Mhm.
real satisfaction. So the unitive state dissolves that. It is when you are in that unitive state, you are experiencing the universe and everyone else as you are. So you are part of everything, everything is part of you. So there is no duality. There's no us versus them. There's just us. And you are contributing to that. And
Mhm.
so when a corporate executive switches from that, rat race model of climbing the ladder over everybody else's bodies, and then focuses more on the common good and the positive experiences, the positive psychological states like gratitude and compassion, um, that is transformational. And that really leads to life satisfaction
Mhm.
because those goals are sustaining and they lead to those positive psychological states. So it's really as simple as that. And the whole idea of ego is, me versus everybody else's egos. But the higher self, the self that is, the deeper self, that is part of everything else.
Mhm.
So that's the transition that I think that's really critical.
One thing that I've noticed in the business setting is when I check in and I ground myself, it's almost like it's contagious with the other people that surround me. I don't know if there's any science behind that, but there's an innate sensing of human beings when there's duality and when there's actual, we'll call it an olive branch or reaching out to be one with the other person. You can sense it in your deepest self, even if you're not a yoga practitioner. And I find that really powerful in a business setting. If you enter into a difficult conversation or a conflict with an open heart, it's very disarming for the other person or the other people, even if they don't have, we'll call it the skills that some of us have practiced over the years. It's magic. It's like magic.
Well,
So, mhm,
conflict and competition breeds more conflict and competition.
mhm,
When somebody comes to you in a competitive manner, I mean, almost instinctively, you're fighting back competitively, and that tends to spiral, and suddenly you have an entirely competitive environment in your workplace where everybody's trying to get ahead of everybody else, and
mhm,
it's me versus them, and I'm at war every day I go to work, and it's me versus everybody else. The other model, of course, is that more unitive state, because in that state there's not that striving, there's not that grasping, there's not that attachment to
mhm,
those goals. There's just trying to do the best that you can. And when you are, not coming from a place of stress and conflict, I mean, we read each other's body language in very subtle ways. And you can tell when somebody's stressed and really, not emotionally settled.
mhm,
And that is uncomfortable. And when a lot of people are experiencing that same kind of body language, it is the gestalt of that community. Whereas if everybody is relaxed and everybody is coming from that unitive, compassionate state, it's a very different environment. And you can feel that, you can experience that. An interesting anecdote is that, we've done studies on the yoga in schools, as I've said, and in one school we had yoga for several years. So a good fraction of the population of the students in that high school had practiced yoga. And we did some qualitative interviews with some of the uh, school staff. And one of the quotes from the counselor was, yoga is making our school a better place.
wow.
It was just referring to that whole change in the tenor of the environment. When you change the individual and you change a lot of individuals, then the whole society starts to change. And we even saw this in anecdotes from some of the kids. They were saying, that during the yoga classes, the distinctions between the browners and the jocks
Mhm,
and the greasers or whatever the different social groups were started to dissolve because they were experiencing that same deeper experience together, and that barrier between them in terms of I'm a browner and he's a jock, that started to dissolve. And
Mm-hmm.
that's another, portrayal of that same phenomenon of that more unitive state between people, which translates into different relationships, different ways of talking, different body language, which with many people then creates this whole sort of new societal experience.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking a lot about the difference between drive, like ambitious drive to get something done, and inspiration to do something. And they're very different feelings. And yoga tips us over into, in my opinion, into the inspiration. When you're inspired to do something, it comes from somewhere a little bit deeper within you, rather than just the cognitive, oh, I need to get this done to beat the other guy. It's more from within, from the bottom of you, coming up through you. And I think that that's really important in a business setting as well for leaders, is to figure out a way to inspire their people rather than just set goals and stick approach versus inspire them to achieve their goals. Because at the end of the day, businesses are doing something. They're making something happen collectively as a group, and hopefully for the betterment of society and hopefully for the betterment of the world. But to be inspired to do something feels much more, we'll call it, much more clear than to just do something in order to beat somebody else. So I think that yoga can help leaders in that way, to create strategies to be more inspirational to their people, and then, to your point, relax and have that ripple effect throughout the organization. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, you talked about yoga in schools. This is not typical, and as you said, the research is going to help us, the research is going to help us administer yoga in different places where we haven't seen it before, due to data and science. But right now, if I'm looking at the audience of this podcast, and I would say that the majority probably haven't done yoga or don't have it as a regular practice. And in this city, anyway, the yoga construct is, housewife kind of Lululemon pants. And frankly, it's quite expensive to do yoga. So can you talk a little bit about your experience in your life and how accessible yoga really could be?
Yeah, I think there's a big disparity within yoga practice, and there's some misconceptions, some major misconceptions of what yoga is.
Mm.
Now, yoga has become very popular. Anything that becomes very popular becomes very diversified. And that is just by definition, that's reality. And that's unavoidable.
Mm-hmm.
So yoga has become popular, and with that popularity, you now have all kinds of yoga out there, and people calling things yoga that, really strain the definition.
Mm.
So there are people out there who are practicing yoga, which is basically just the physical postures and exercises. People come in, they do the physical postures and exercises. When they're done, they're out the door. There's no meditation, there's no breathing, there's no relaxation, there's no philosophy. It is just the exercises. Mm. And, the goal of that practice is to become fit and to become slim, and that's it. It's, it's slimming yoga. And that's in counterpoint to the traditional practice of yoga, which is really focused ultimately on these spiritual changes that take place. But to achieve those, you adjust the physical body, you improve the breathing, you improve your ability to relax, you engage in these meditative practices which increase mind-body awareness and mindfulness, and ultimately lead to these deeper states. So you have this whole spectrum of what yoga practices are out there, and that spectrum has actually created misconception in the population. So the population, some segments of the population are prone to think of yoga in two opposite extremes. One is, oh, yoga, that's for flexible people. Mm. That's for women, because they're more flexible, and that's what they do. And, you have to be flexible. And I'm just not into that. It's kind of touchy-feely. And so that's this misconception of yoga is not applicable to every population. And that, of course, is a misconception because men can practice yoga, children can practice yoga, the elderly can practice yoga, and lo and behold, even the diseased populations can practice yoga. You can always adjust the yoga style and practice to accommodate them. And when you include the breathing and the meditation component, you are definitely providing a lot more benefit than just the physical exercises. So that's one extreme, is, this idea of yoga is just for women, just for white women in leotards. The other extreme, which we often see more manifested in schools, is the idea, oh, yoga, that's from India. That's part of the Hindu religion. Yoga is a religion. I'm not allowed to practice yoga. I'm in a different religion, and my religion won't allow me to practice yoga because that's a religion. And that's a misconception, because the basic practices of yoga are the physical postures and exercises, the breath regulation techniques, the deep relaxation, physical relaxation, and the focus of attention in the act of meditation. That's a cognitive process. None of that is based on belief of any kind. None of that is based upon any kind of religious dogma. Those are mind-body practices, either changing the body, changing the breath, or changing the mind, and working with that. Those are mind-body practices. They are not religious in any way. Now, having said that, a lot of people that are religious use yoga, and yoga can actually enhance, religious activity, like it can enhance any kind of activity. But it is not, at its core, per se, a religion, because it doesn't have a belief system. In fact, you can believe that yoga doesn't work. You can believe that yoga is a joke. You practice it, you still get the same positive benefits. Because it is a mind-body practice, it's not a belief system. So that's the other misrepresentation. So we really have a responsibility in the yoga community to educate the general public that yoga is not just for women and for flexible people, and that it's not a religion, and therefore it can be practiced by any population under any circumstances.
And with the accessibility issue with respect to studios having high overhead and having to charge, minimum, most of the time, $20 per class, it's not truly accessible at the studio level to all parts of the population. But there are so many resources on YouTube. You can type in words like 20-minute yoga or 30-minute meditation and access it for free. So that at-home practice is such a beautiful thing, I find. The only thing missing is the community aspect, which is so powerful, and which is what got me into yoga at the very beginning, was the community aspect. So just for everybody out there, definitely Google and see what you can find on YouTube by way of practice. It can be accessible. There's also community associations that do it for a lower price, etc. Can you tell us a little bit? You mentioned the word Kundalini as the first method, or the method of yoga that you studied. You talked about lots of different types of yoga. Can you tell us a little bit about what is Kundalini and what does that mean?
Well, Kundalini is just a word. I mean, it refers to the energy going up the spine, but all yoga really deals with that. All the philosophy of yoga is all about raising the Kundalini. There's a lot of terms like that deal with the subtle energy. There's terms like prana, which deal with the energy of the body. But all forms of yoga, basically, theoretically, will affect that. And so the yoga I practice is slightly different than other forms of yoga, and different forms of yoga are different from each other. They all have different characteristics. They all have different emphases. Some yoga practices really strongly emphasize the physical practices, and some types of yoga really emphasize the more deeper spiritual meditative practices. And there's a whole spectrum of the different styles of yoga. Kundalini yoga that I practice tends to be focused more along the deeper spiritual side of things, where the focus is really on meditation, on improving one's well-being, improving one's state of mind and emotions, and becoming a better individual, and then ultimately achieving these sort of deeper changes in life meaning and purpose. And so that's how the different styles differ, and they're called different names. Different yoga styles have different names. Some of them are named after their progenitors, but that is again part of the diversification of yoga.
Absolutely. And I find for me anyway, the practice started off as exactly what you said at the beginning. Yoga for fitness. That's what brought me to yoga. I was like, oh, this hot yoga sounds fun. Probably sweat a lot and get a good workout. And then what happened over 22 years was a complete change in why I do yoga. And now it's much more of a spiritual practice for me. And I practice what's called yin in the public domain of just holding postures for 3 to 5 minutes each. It's really all about meditation and permanent change in the body and the mind. And so that evolution can happen over time. And so if there is a type of yoga that attracts a person, it's okay if it's not exactly what you would expect, or if it's not a spiritual side of yoga, if it's a fitness side, because eventually, perhaps through different chapters of your life, there might be the opportunity to get deeper into the practice, as you mentioned, and more about the wellness aspect. So true. So
Well,
true.
there's actually research now showing that that is actually a very real and measurable phenomenon.
Hmm.
And there's many people in India who get very upset with this whole idea that people in the U.S. are practicing sort of these more limited forms of yoga, and then doing things like goat yoga and beer yoga and wine yoga
Yeah.
and all of these other derivatives. Um, and my view is that they have their place. The people that are practicing those limited forms of yoga are perhaps just doing the physical postures and exercises. But even those are somewhat different than Western aerobic type exercises that lead to this deeper state of relaxation, this deeper
Mhm.
sense of peace and calm just by their nature. And so what happens is that, just as the anecdote you've conveyed, we see very common experiences where people come in for very physical basic reasons. I'm here to fix my stress. I'm here to fix my
Mhm.
knee. I'm here to fix my shoulder. I'm here to fix my outbursts because my neighbor told me that it was really helping. So, I'm coming to that yoga class. Don't give me the spiritual stuff. I just want the yoga stuff so that I can deal with this one little tiny issue. And so they go into the yoga class. It may be a limited form. They start to practice the yoga, and then a month later they say, "Okay, my knee's better." But I'm starting to feel a little bit better about myself. I'm feeling a little bit more emotionally stable. I'm a little bit less stressed, and I like that experience. But I feel like I could get more, and I'm not getting more in this yoga class. So I think I might try going across the street to that studio where they do a lot more of the meditation and the breathing stuff, so that I can get more of that experience. And that is a very common trend that we see. In fact, survey studies have now been published in several countries, which have evaluated in long-term yoga practitioners what their original reasons were for yoga practice. And they are these more mundane reasons. I want to go for flexibility. I want to go for wellness. I want to go to fix a disease. And then when they ask the question, what are your current reasons for continuing yoga practice? What is really dominant is spirituality.
Mm.
And that is actually now so a real phenomenon that people make this transition. They come in for trivial reasons and then end up staying for these deeper lifestyle reasons.
Mm. That's amazing. And it's gives us kind of inspiration to at least get started and try it out, even if it's just to help an ankle at the beginning. And perhaps you'll catch the bug like you and I have, especially you, and make it a part of your lifestyle. This is wonderful. Thank you so much. Where can people find you? Is there a website, or is there, if somebody needs you to come and do a talk or do some research, how can we find you?
So I actually work as the director of yoga research for the Yoga Alliance. And so if you're a member of the Yoga Alliance, and then there's other things you can get from the Yoga Alliance on the research, we have a free access website on the Yoga Alliance that allows you to access the research studies. We put a lot of citations out. We created a lot of professional webinars that summarize the research on a yoga that's been done. And this is specifically targeted for yoga teachers and yoga practitioners. to share what we know about the science and research on yoga.
Mhm.
That's one way to access what I've done. There's a number of my lectures that, of course, end up on YouTube. These are lectures that I've done in academic departments or in workshops or in whatever places. So those of course are freely available as well. And for those people that wish to contact me, for something like giving a lecture or a workshop at a yoga studio, which I do routinely. I give yoga research workshops at yoga studios, and that really conveys a lot of this information in a very direct way. I work as the director of research for the Kundalini Research Institute, and so you can look up that on their website, Kundalini Research Institute. There are research pages there, but there's an opportunity to send an email directly to me. You can say that, please convey this to me, and that will reach me through the Kundalini Research Institute.
Perfect. I will make sure to include all of these resources in the show notes for the podcast so that people can easily access it if they scroll down. Dr. Khalsa, I can't thank you enough for your time and your energy this morning. I've learned so much. Appreciate your time, and I hope to stay in touch with you.
Sounds great. Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you. We'll talk soon.